So unlike the 7D, which has that phase detect autofocus available to you within live view, the 7000 only has the contrast detect. But the 7000 does have additional focus modes within that contrast detect mechanism. And so you can see on the screen it says AFS, which is single servo mode. If you hold down the AF button in the front of the camera and then move the rear dial, the main dial, you can see it switching between AFS, which is single servo, and then AFF, which is continuous servo. So you can use that if you want to be able to track motion or subjects moving in live view, the same as you would if you were using a dynamic focus outside of live view on the 7000. In addition, you can see there's that norm display next to the AFS. That shows you what size of AF sensor the camera's going to use for the contrast detect. And so if I hold down the AF button and use the front subdial, I can change that from normal to wide. And you can see there that the size of the square increases. And what that does is give the camera a larger target to focus on. So for instance, if you only have there's only enough contrast in a certain aspect of the image on the edges of the autofocus for the normal mode, it may not be a large enough area for the camera to find adequate focus. And so by increasing the size of the focus area, you're basically increasing the size of this virtual autofocus sensor so that it gives the camera a larger target to find a focus on. Now, in addition to that wide mode, the camera also has a face detect mode, which will ignore which focus box you currently have select, because normally it would focus only on this area, but instead will attempt to find a face within your image, and if it finds one, it'll focus on that face in preference over your current focus box. And so that's very useful if you're not holding the camera at eye level and you want to be able to get a human subject, human face in focus. You can just switch to the face priority mode and focus, and the camera will automatically find it. Now, I don't have a face in this current subject, so if I attempt to focus with the face detect, the camera's not going to find one. It's just going to give up, and it's going to revert to the normal rectangular focus target. Now, an additional focus mode on the 7000 is something really neat, where you can track any portion of the subject within the frame. And so this is sort of like the face detect, where the camera, instead of the camera trying to find a face to focus on and always keeping that face in focus, even if it moves around the frame, with this mode, you can instead just tell the camera which part of the frame you want it to track and to keep in focus. And so you can use this for your human faces as well as any inanimate object. And so in this case, I'll select the R on the jar, and I'll press the OK button. And now the camera switches that box to a yellow. And so now if you move the camera, regardless of where that selected box moves within the frame, the camera is going to attempt to keep it within focus. And so it's sort of like the the auto servo tracking modes outside of live view. And so it's a great way to lock on focus for the subject that's important to you within the frame, and to keep it in focus even if that subject is moving around the frame. So that's a pretty neat feature on the 7000. Now, as far as the other focusing modes available on the 7D, you don't have the continuous focus mode that's available on the D7000, which actually comes in more handy on the 7000 for the movie mode. So it lets you treat the camera or use it pretty much like a camcorder, where it constantly generates focus. I'll save that review for another day, but the usefulness of that continuous autofocus really depends on how fast your subject is moving, because even though the D7000 continuously autofocuses, it's not nearly as fast as the type of autofocus you would find on a dedicated camcorder. So the modes that are available on the 7D are the live view mode, which I've already shown, which is just the normal contrast mode. And then there's the AF quick mode, which reverts to the legacy phase detect mode, where it lifts the mirror in order to generate that quick focus, but maybe not as precise as the contrast. And then the 7D, just like the 7000, has a face detect mode, which is this AFL, where the camera will ignore your current focus box and attempt to find a face within the frame, and then focus on that and keep that in focus, even if that face moves around the image while you're in live view. All right, so I'll do a quick focus speed comparison. So both cameras are set to contrast autofocus, and with the subject pretty much already in focus, so the camera's just going to reacquire the same focus. So if I press the focus on both cameras at the same time, they both pretty much acquire a focus at identical speeds. And so with the subject already in focus, their contrast focus performance is almost identical. So now what I'll do is I'll go ahead and rack focus to intentionally make the image out of focus on both cameras. to see how long it would take to focus when the camera actually has to move the lens a bit more. And then hold down the autofocus in this case. In that case, the 7000 beat the 7D by almost 2 seconds. I'll go ahead and try that one more time. So I'll go ahead and rack focus on the 7D and then rack focus on the 7000. Hold down autofocus on both at the same time. And again, the 7000 appreciably outperforms the 7D as far as in the speed of acquisition for contrast autofocus. Now, one important technical difference between the Canon and Nikon in live view is that on the Canon, when you take a photograph in live view mode, the mirror actually stays up when you take the photograph, and so there's no potential for mirror slap causing vibration, which can become apparent in the slower shutter speeds. On the 7000, though, when you take a photograph in live view, the camera actually drops the mirror to take the photograph and then pops you back into live view and puts the mirror back up. And so what that can do is introduce mirror slap depending on your shutter speed. So in order to avoid that on the 7000, you actually have to use either exposure delay mode, which you can configure in the menu, or you can switch the mode dial to mirror up lockup mode, which is also available to you within live view. So one last thing I'll demonstrate is the difference in clarity on the LCDs at the highest magnification level. And so this one big improvement that Nikon made with the 7000 relative to the D90 is that on the D90, for the magnified view, what they did is they took a low resolution snapshot off the image, and then to magnify, all they did was interpolate that data so that when you magnify, rather than actually getting closer to the actual pixels and getting a 1-to-1 magnification, on the D90 you would get an interpolated image which was not nearly as sharp and made it nearly impossible to focus precisely. So Nikon corrected that on the 7000, where now the apparent sharpness and clarity you get for the full magnification view is pretty much identical between the Canon and the D7000 implementation. So that concludes my live view comparison between the Nikon D7000 and the Canon 7D. To summarize the advantages of each of the cameras, starting with the 7D offers a live histogram, which is useful for establishing correct exposure before you take the photograph. 7D also offers an exposure meter, which is useful to that same regard. It offers exposure simulation with none of the shutter speed or aperture limitations that are present in the D7000's implementation, as far as that manual movie settings mode. The 7D also offers a depth of field preview, which is useful in many instances, for example, establishing the hyperfocal distance. 7D offers what I consider better zoom button placement for a one-handed operation. Allows you to use the one hand to both zoom and release the shutter, with the other hand available to manipulate the lens, either for focusing or for zooming the lens. 7D offers both phase and contrast detect autofocus within live view. And lastly, the 7D's mirror stays up when shooting, which means you don't have to use a separate mirror lockup mode like you would have to do on the D7000. Now, regarding the D7000's advantages, the D7000 allows you to zoom and focus to the extreme edges of the frame in the contrast detect mode. That allows you to focus at the very edges, whereas on the 7D, you're limited to that 70 or 80% perimeter around the frame. The D7000 also provides all of its metering modes available within live view, whereas the 7D is limited to evaluative metering. D7000 also provides both the zoom in and zoom out buttons with a single button to immediately return back to unmagnified view, whereas the 7D has only a zoom in button and you need to cycle through all the magnifications in order to return back to unmagnified. D7000 also provides subject tracking AF mode, which is similar to the face tracking but allows you to specify any subject within the frame to track rather than being limited just to face tracking like on the 7D. It also offers continuous autofocus, which is especially useful for video. And lastly, the D7000 provides faster contrast autofocus. So for my personal style of shooting and workflow, the 7D offers a more complete and feature-rounded live view implementation. But certainly each camera offers features that the other doesn't, and deciding which of those features are important is for you to decide. That's why I wanted to do this comparison, wanted to lay out each of the camera's features so that you can make your own evaluation as to which camera is a better fit for your particular needs.